Morning. I'm a professor, so I'm always doing things like that. I'm Sam Martin. I'm the Frank and Bethune Church Endowed Chair of Public Service here in the Frank Church Institute. And together with Monica, I just want to join in the chorus of thanks. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting us. Thank you to our board for always standing behind us. Thank you to the people who have agreed to be here.
Welcome to our beautiful and dynamic campus. Frank Church was devoted to both promoting and protecting democracy. He also cared deeply about security and privacy. Our university is committed to building the kind of future America that Frank Church envisioned. We've built a number of programs that are deeply connected to this work. Cyber for All is a program that lets any major get a certificate in cybersecurity. And our other cybersecurity initiatives, like the Institute for Pervasive Cybersecurity and our Cyberdome, allow our students to deeply engage in the work of learning how to be ethical citizens in a new technological landscape. The university has joined the Council on Competitiveness, which allows us to advance American competitiveness in a global landscape. We're one of just a handful of universities represented on that prestigious board that brings together leaders in labor, industry, and education. I'm very proud that we brought Boise State to the G7 Summit to sign the Upwards Partnership. This partnership with 5 universities in the U.S. and 5 in Japan will allow us to work together to ensure that America is competitive in the semiconductor industry, to train people for this important industry that's at the cornerstone of every kind of technology available to us today, from refrigerators to computers, but also to advance American security so that we're not dependent on other nations for this critical component. I want to thank you for coming together around these important topics, and I want to give a special thank you to the Frank Church Institute and the board for your passion and commitment, not just to bringing forward new ideas, but to honoring the legacy of this great man. We recognize that each individual has a unique set of experiences and backgrounds, and these are crucial to our ability to address the truly complex challenges that our country is facing, challenges that Frank Church himself sought to address. To build a successful future, we must do so together. Your diligent work is so vital. I'm sorry I was unable to join you at this important conference. Our annual state board meeting is being hosted in another city, but I thank you for coming together for this important work, and I thank you for helping to continue to lead us forward.
Sometimes feels like the trust between us, especially as citizens, has frayed to the point that the rend in the fabric is torn completely through. People either share our worldview or they don't. And if they don't, then many of us believe they and their worldview and their very motives are untrustworthy. Sometimes they even stop mattering to us. Institutions are against us, we say, unless the people we voted for or the people we like best are in charge of them. Anyone else will cheat us, beat us, and otherwise make our lives less good. We're actually not supposed to feel this way. I remind my students of the words all the time. We the people. We are the people. When the nation's founders wrote those words and began the constitutional narrative of the United States, they said they were beginning that story both for themselves and for their posterity. Their posterity. That's a big word, but it means us. It means their future. Democracy holds together through ideas like freedom and equality, but also because of institutional strongholds that work. Among these strongholds are Congress, the presidency, the courts, and the many public servants who work behind the scenes in places like the State Department, the CIA, the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, and believe it or not, even the DMV. These institutions make up the state and in this nation, and I have to tell you, this is my very favorite part. In this nation, The state isn't supposed to notice the differences between us when it comes to protecting our rights. It isn't supposed to notice if we share the political views of the people at the top or not when it comes to protecting our rights. That's called equal protection of the laws. No matter our gender, our religion, our sexuality, our body type, our race, our ethnicity, no matter what, we all merit the same rights. Our rights are neutrally granted because we simply exist as citizens of this place. Those rights are then guaranteed, and they are made sure that we have them each day by the democratic institutions each generation has created and passed down. The institutions we must make sure we give to those who come after us. Rights are not just ideas. They are things that make our country work. Today we'll be thinking about Frank Church's legacy when it comes to these questions. He did some amazing things. And we'll consider how Boise State is contributing to the future of keeping us all safe and keeping us all free. To that end, our university president, Dr. Marlene Tromp, was very sorry that she couldn't be with us today, but she took the time to record a video to share some thoughts about what we're doing, about our goals at the Frank Church Institute, and about the meaning of democratic institutions and how we can all come together to make them stronger, truer, and more just.
Welcome to our beautiful and dynamic campus. Frank Church was devoted to both promoting and protecting. Welcome to our beautiful and dynamic campus. Frank Church was devoted to both promoting and protecting democracy. He also cared deeply about security and privacy. Welcome to our beautiful and dynamic campus. Frank Church was devoted to both promoting and protecting democracy. He also cared deeply about security and privacy. Our university is committed to building the kind of future America that Frank Church envisioned. We built a number of programs that are deeply connected to this work. Cyber for All is a program that lets any major get a certificate in cybersecurity. And our other cybersecurity initiatives, like the Institute for Pervasive Cybersecurity and our Cyberdome, allow our students to deeply engage in the work of learning how to be ethical citizens in a new technological landscape. The university has joined the Council on Competitiveness, which allows us to advance American competitiveness in a global landscape. We're one of just a handful of universities represented on that prestigious board that brings together leaders in labor, industry, and education. I'm very proud that we brought Boise State to the G7 Summit to sign the Upwards Partnership. This partnership with 5 universities in the US and 5 in Japan will allow us to work together to ensure that America is competitive in the semiconductor industry, to train people for this important industry that's at the cornerstone of every kind of technology available to us today, from refrigerators to computers, but also to advance American security so that we're not dependent on other nations for this critical component. I want to thank you for coming together around these important topics, and I want to give a special thank you to the Frank Church Institute and the board for your passion and commitment, not just to bringing forward new ideas, but to honoring the legacy of this great man. We recognize that each individual has a unique set of experiences and backgrounds, and these are crucial to our ability to address the truly complex challenges that our country is facing. Challenges that Frank Church himself sought to address. To build a successful future, we must do so together. Your diligent work is so vital. I'm sorry I was unable to join you at this important conference. Our annual state board meeting is being hosted in another city, but I thank you for coming together for this important work, and I thank you for helping to continue to lead us forward.
I don't know why, but more than once since I've moved back to Boise, I've been asked if I am Dr. Marlene Trump, like out at a restaurant, so maybe it's almost like she's here. I think if you're a woman and you cut your hair short, everybody looks the same. At this time, we're going to begin our first panel, which is about the judiciary. So I will introduce the moderator, but as I do that, I just was thinking, the judiciary is in trouble. The Supreme Court has gone from being the most venerated institution in the United States, really by far, to being among the most imperiled. In 2007, nearly 3/4 of Americans had a favorable view of the court. That's just about 15 years ago. 3/4 had a favorable view of the court. Now that number is only about 40%, and it really varies by party. So that's another instance of deep polarization in terms of the numbers. It's similar when we look at how people feel about the American political system as a whole, and it's very worrisome. Our first panel this morning, moderated by Josh Hurwitz, is here to think about this fading trust and what the judiciary still means to us in the United States. Mr. Hurwitz, a graduate of Harvard Law School, is now U.S. Attorney for the state of Idaho. He has a decade of experience working as a public federal litigator and has prosecuted financial crimes, public corruption cases, and environmental crimes, among lots of other interesting things. As Josh comes up, and as I look at these numbers that I've just mentioned, I really have to wonder, and I really hope that these smart folks have words of wisdom that I haven't come up with yet. So let me just ask you, what needs to happen for us to rebuild trust in the judiciary in this very, very turbulent time? So, Mr. Josh Hurwitz.
Excuse me. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Monica. Thank you all for being here. Why don't we have our panelists come up while I kind of filibuster here for a second. We discussed whether to do formal introductions of our three esteemed judges, and their bios, Judge Smith and Judge Bush's bios, are on the online materials for the conference. We had a late substitution with Judge Deborah Gresham, who's a magistrate judge here at the federal court for the District of Idaho. Betty Richardson, as you probably saw, was planning to be on this panel and then unfortunately has a rebound case of COVID, so she's not able to join us today. But we're very fortunate to have Judge Gresham. So let me just offer some very brief introductions. Judge Gresham is the newest member of the federal bench here in Idaho as a magistrate judge. She hails from the Bay Area, went to Berkeley, which with my alma mater, Stanford, will continue, excuse me, their rivalry in the Atlantic Coast Conference next year, which demonstrates that we are indeed in turbulent times. But Judge Gresham practiced and had an outstanding career in private practice, focusing on First Amendment law. So perhaps that will come up here today, and now serves as I said, a magistrate judge for the District of Idaho, serving the entire state and keeping my prosecutors in line. I will turn next to Judge William Smith, native of Boise. Judge Smith moved to Rhode Island, where he completed his education, actually in Georgetown for law school, and then went to Rhode Island and practiced in private practice, and was appointed to the federal bench as a district judge, Article III judge by George W. Bush, where he has served ever since. And finally, but not least, Judge Bush, retired Judge Bush, of the District of Idaho, formerly as a magistrate judge, a native of Idaho, long-standing member of the legal community. Judge Bush was a state court judge prior to taking the bench at the federal level. So what I will say before we get into the questions is that this is an unusual circumstance for me. Usually I'm the one being asked the questions by the judges. So I'm going to try to get used to asking questions of judges, and I will not let this temporary station in life go to my head. So before we actually get into the questions, we thought it would be helpful to talk about some terminology. What is the judiciary? What is the rule of law? How is the judiciary arranged? So I'm going to try to do that very quickly and I would invite the panelists to continue to define those terms if I do an inadequate job. But I'll start with what is the judiciary? And I think simply put, the judiciary is a set of courts comprised of judges that decide disputes and interpret the law as it arises in individual cases. And the judiciary exists within separate jurisdictions, separate sovereigns. There's a federal judiciary, there are state judiciaries, there are even administrative agencies that have judicial functions, and so there's what are called administrative judges that are part of the judiciary in that sense. Again, to sort of frame the conversation, and we have judges who have represented different levels. We have sort of going from the bottom to the top. At the federal level and at the state level, there are magistrate judges who have certain functions. There are trial court or district judges that have similar and additional functions. Above the trial court level, we have the appellate court, intermediate appellate courts, and then, of course, there's the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, which I'm sure will come up, as well as each state has its own Supreme Court, which decides matters of state law, with the federal judiciary focusing on federal law, of course. Rule of law. This is, I think, something that Sam already, I think, defined well for us, which essentially gets down to the equal protection of the law for all citizens and residents of a jurisdiction. But I wanted to share with you the definition that the U.S. courts have of the rule of law on their website. And it states, the rule of law is a principle under which all persons, institutions, and entities are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, independently adjudicated, and consistent with international human rights principles. So we can perhaps get into that as well. And then finally, I think it's helpful, and this is something that Judge Bush helped me frame, you know, the law, what is the law, right? It comes from many sources. If you look at the federal system, we of course have the Constitution, which was enacted by our founders, our framers. We have statutory law, which is enacted by Congress. And then we have case law, which interprets both of those sources and others, which is handed down essentially by judges through court decisions and opinions. And so we'll be discussing, I think, the interactions of those sources of law and the tension perhaps between them as we look at the rising mistrust or distrust in the judiciary and what each of those branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial perhaps can contribute to this issue. So with that, let's start, panelists, judges, by talking about why trust in the judiciary matters in the first place. And so perhaps Judge Smith, you could start us out by responding to the question or the prompt, what are the positive effects of high trust in the judiciary?
Well, first, let me just, okay. It's really wonderful to be here. And I would just say how nice it is to be here at the Frank Church Conference, because I traveled here from Rhode Island and I love coming back to Idaho. But one of the reasons is because so many of us, and Ron and I share this, spent some time working with Senator Church, and he was a mentor for us and really set a path of public service for so many people who are in this room. And it's lovely to see all these young people here, because you are the ones that are going to carry us forward from here. So to get us started to respond to the question, why does the rule of law matter? Why does trust in the judiciary matter? We're a country that depends on trust in institutions. The judiciary is just one of the institutions that we rely We rely on our executive branch, Congress, judiciary as the three branches of government. But beyond the three branches of government, we rely on the media, the press. We rely on our colleges and universities, our educational system. We rely on the military, which is part of the government. Everyone has a role to play, and our ability to trust in each of these institutions to follow the law and to uphold our oaths of office and to do our jobs is what keeps the country together. So much of the Constitution is aspirational, and it's really our willingness as a people to be governed by a system that we have put in place that keeps the country together. So specifically with respect to the judiciary, there's nothing in the Constitution that explicitly says the judiciary the holdings of the courts must be followed. That is a construct that was developed by the judiciary and is accepted by the people and by other institutions in our government. And that's the way it's been since Marbury versus Madison, when Chief Justice Marshall declared that it's fundamentally the role of the judiciary to say what the law is. And the judiciary has as famously stated by Justice Frankfurter, the judiciary does not have an army. The judiciary does not have the power of the purse. We depend on Congress for our budgets. We don't have any independent way to enforce what we find, other than to rely on the people to live with and to follow the rulings that are handed down by the courts. So if you unravel that, just as if you unravel faith in other institutions, whether they're governmental institutions or non-governmental institutions, the fabric of the country begins to fray. And where does that lead? It ultimately leads to anarchy, and anarchy can lead to tyranny. So, and I don't mean to be melodramatic about it or overstate it, but it really is fundamental to our system that we can trust our institutions. Now, sometimes we say, well, the judiciary, it does pretty well. When you look at the graph that was up, you see how low the trust is in public institutions. Well, the judiciary has always done better than other governmental institutions. But to be on the top deck of a sinking ship is only a relative advantage, so the fact that the judiciary has historically been more trusted than other branches of government, that's terrific. That too is going away. Polls show that people have far less trust in the judiciary than they have historically. So it's a critical problem, and we're going to talk a lot more about the reasons for the decline in public trust in the judiciary, or trust overall in the judiciary, and we'll talk, I hope, about some solutions. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Judge. Judge Gresham, from your perspective, why is trust in the judiciary so important?
Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. I am not Betty Richardson, and I'm sorry that I'm not Betty Richardson. I'm sure she would have had many wonderful things to say on the late ad, but I'm very honored to be here because I think this is one of the most important topics facing us as a country, is just trust in our government. And I'm here on behalf of the judiciary, and I am very concerned about trust in the judiciary. I think trust is, for all the reasons Judge Smith laid out much more articulately than I could have, especially on late notice. But I'm a magistrate judge in the federal courts. Now, I take issue with Josh's, I'm not at the bottom, I don't call it that. I call it I'm the first line. The bottom of that, yeah. I'm not at the bottom, I feel like I'm the first line. So I am the face of people coming to court, usually in very dire circumstances. Most of my docket day-to-day is criminal. I am the face of the judiciary for most people. And what does that mean to me? That means that I am the person that is standing between them and serious charges, and I am entrusted with making sure that every single person that comes in front of me is treated fairly, is treated equally, and is ensured that their constitutional rights will be honored. I take that responsibility very, very seriously. It is the greatest honor of my life to be able to be in this position, to serve the people and to serve the folks that come in front of me. I've heard the judiciary referred to as the watchdog of liberty. And I feel like that is what I do every single day in my small little ways. I am making sure that everyone that comes in my court is treated fairly, equally, and that their rights, their fundamental rights, are honored. And so when I hear that there is a lack of trust in the judiciary, that hits me very personally now more than ever. And I'm wondering where those numbers come from. I know that the chart we saw said that people have a lack of trust of their government in Washington, right? It's always easy to talk about folks that are far away, they're not doing any good, but we like our own person. It's like saying, I don't like lawyers in general, but I like my lawyer, or, there's always that kind of thing. And so when I'm hearing about people having distrust in the judiciary, I know there's been a whole bunch of high-profile cases of late that have changed the landscape in some specific ways. And I know that there's a great many people that are wondering why that has happened, and they attribute many factors to it. I'm not going to do that. But I understand that that gives people pause, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that, about how individual judges look at different things and how do we trust those judges to carry out their oaths. But I think fundamentally, every person I know on our court, and Judge Bush was on our court for a very long time, I know we are a small court, but we take our oaths very seriously. We do the best we can. We're all human. But I can tell you, every single day that I go home, I make decisions every day about people, whether or not they should be detained, which is a fancy word for going to jail, or whether they should be released on conditions pending charges. This is when they're presumed innocent. These are weighty decisions that I make every single day. And I can tell you, every time I make those, I ask myself as I go home, was that the right decision? I really never take for granted that I'm making these very weighty decisions about liberty for individuals, and I think of them as my friends, my parents, my sisters, my brother, whatever. Those are the people that come in front of me. I want to make sure they are treated with the kind of respect and care that I would want anyone that I care about to be done. So when it comes to trust in the judiciary, I hope that I'm helping to give people trust. I'm doing my little part in my little bottom of the totem pole world. And I think that every judge that is sitting on a bench and having this weighty responsibility is trying to do the same thing there. It concerns me that the public's perception, particularly on these high-profile cases that come out of DC that are not necessarily things that we're dealing with every single day in our state, are eroding the trust that we are working to build. And so I will continue my little part of trying to be my watchdog of liberty here in Idaho. And I know each of us all take that very, very, very true to our hearts, and we do the best we can. So I'm working on having trust. I think being here is part of the little things that I can do. People can get to know me and understand what my judicial philosophy is, and hopefully have trust in the kind of things that I do. And I think every judge strives to have people understand that, and then thereby have trust in at least my part of the judiciary. And I hope that each of us moves forward on that.
Thank you, Judge. Judge Bush, as a retired judge and as someone who served on the bench for many years, what's your perspective on this problem, and perhaps touch on the negative consequences of this declining trust?
Well, as a retired judge, I have a little more latitude to comment upon some things in the public sphere than I did previously, and therein lies part of the issue of what we're talking about, is the third branch, the judiciary, when it's attacked, when it's criticized, doesn't have the ability to respond in a way that others might to that criticism, and some of that will enlarge upon. But think about that, and how that affects the public forum and the courts. The negative effects of a lack of confidence in the judiciary are all around us in today's world. And the one that comes to my mind most immediately is that day in January, several weeks before the inauguration of President Biden, when the Capitol was stormed. And I was working in my chambers that day and started getting the news feeds coming across my phone, and I had been concerned about that for some time because of the nature of the commentary that had been leading up to it and the claims of election interference. And I suspect, like many of you, I couldn't believe what I was then seeing when I turned to the news coverage. And then in the months following that, I had various of the people who were identified by federal authorities as being involved in those events, and who were arrested in Idaho on charges that were filed in the District of Columbia federal court, arraigned in my courtroom, made decisions such as Judge Grasham was talking about release, and all the ones that I had in front of me. The U.S. Attorney's Office recommended release on conditions. But in those proceedings and in the very fact of what happened, I just felt like there was something had happened in the world that the folks who were in front of me and on those cases lived in, that was an enormous disconnect in either their understanding of or their belief in our form of government. Insidious kinds of statements that were made. And so if folks in that context or in other contexts don't believe that, for instance, a claim that there had been problems at the polls could be properly resolved in the forums that our system has for considering such questions, but rather they would storm the Capitol and try to do such things by force, then we got a problem. The courts are a safe harbor in our democracy. They're a place for disputes to be resolved that otherwise have no place to be considered and decided. They are figuratively and literally a safe place. And that's why courtrooms are designed the way they are, so that people can come into them and feel like they are protected from whatever's happening on the outside that make them feel like they haven't got a friend in the world, or that nobody's going to listen to what they have to say. And the court's role and the judge's role is to make sure that they're treated fairly. And then when the matters are decided and considered, that it's apparent to the people involved that the court, that the judge has, and the jury has taken all of that, listened carefully, thought about it carefully, decided carefully, and at the end of it, you hope that everyone involved, even if the result is not what they wanted, they'd hoped for, that they feel like they were fairly treated and that they were heard, and they realize that that's far better than having some despot just say, this is what's going to happen to you. And if you consider about all of the democracies in the world, and then those countries whose democracies are struggling, often the weakest point in that chain that keeps those countries together is the judiciary, because that's the area that the folks who are seeking to damage the democracy can most easily attack and make infirm. And so all of these things have happened more over recent years. And I just would close by just saying one additional thing, which I think is illustrative. Some years ago, I had a case in my court in federal courthouse involving a person who's sometimes referred to as a constitutionalist, who believes that their understanding of some particular provision of the Constitution, for often in recent decades, it was often whether or not the government could properly impose income tax, for instance, or something. But constitutionalists who believe a particular thing, because he said, I can read the Constitution, I can understand it, I know what it says, and it says this. And so I tried to visit with him from the bench after listening to him carefully, and a bright man and well-spoken, and I tried to then visit with him about, well, if everybody has the right to say what the law is, then where does that leave us? And then we had a little more of an extended conversation about that. And I tried to then say, and that's in our system what the third branch is all about. Because somebody, some part of our government has to have the final say about what it means, and then we all have to agree that that's what it means, unless and until in the proper manner that is changed for some reason, whether it's something that the Congress can change properly or whether a higher court might rule differently. And so what I finally did was I talked to him. I asked him if he was in a neighborhood that had a community association with CC&Rs, and he said, yeah. And I said, all right, well, you've got certain rules about things. And he said, yeah. And I said, so what would you do if everybody in the neighborhood decided that some particular important provision of your CCRs meant different things to different people? Then where would you be? And he thought about that, and he said, I don't have a good answer for that. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. So these are important things, and we'll talk about how we can hopefully kind of change the rudder on the ship.
Well, Judge, I didn't know that you had the skills of working with constitutionalists, so we might bring you in as a contractor in your retirement. But I think the human nature of what you just touched on is important, because as we think about the rule of law, as a society, we decide that there is an ultimate deciding authority. But when we look at the courts, ultimately that's a body made up of humans, right, with different worldviews and backgrounds, opinions, biases, implicit or otherwise. So how do we square the human nature of the judiciary with this concept of a rule of law that should be objectively applied and universally accepted? And I'll ask perhaps Judge Smith to start with that topic, please.
Sure. Well, we talk a lot about the rule of law. What is the rule of law? I like to think about the rule of law in a kind of simple construct about and where the courts fit in on that. First is, we are an institution that is evidence-based. All right? We make decisions based on what is presented in a courtroom by witnesses or documents, things that are legitimate evidence. That's number one. Number two, we are an institution that is built around the idea of due process, which means everybody gets to have their say and their opportunity to put on the evidence that they have. And third, we are an institution that tries to follow a certain regime of ethics in how we make decisions, and we try to follow the law as it's given to us, the Constitution, statutory law, and the precedents that we're required to follow. Now, that doesn't mean that every judge is going to reach exactly the same decision in every case. But what it does mean, going to what Judge Bush just described, what it does mean is that when parties come to court, they should feel like they have had their opportunity to put on their best case, to make their best argument, and to get a rational and a reasoned decision in response to that. And if they disagree, they can take it upstairs, as we like to say, to the next court. And it's a great thing. There's always 3 judges who are ready to review every decision that I make on the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and they're more than willing to examine what I've done very carefully. Now, to Josh's question, how do we know that judges aren't just making it up as they go, doing whatever they think? Well, it's that process that I just described, and more, that ensures that judges aren't just making decisions based on what they had for breakfast that morning, or whether they like a particular lawyer or dislike another lawyer or whatever. Now, that is not to say that we don't all have our personal views and our biases and our backgrounds. We do. And as we train judges, we try to train. I do a lot of training of judges in the federal courts. We try to talk to them about recognizing what your own inclinations and biases might be, just to be aware of those things, and to try to step past those things and to make the decision, whatever the decision is, based on the facts and the law. The system is built. Not only are there other judges who are ready to review my homework, but I have to justify myself in a sense, to my peers. I don't want to be known as the judge who just makes it up, that is the judge that, doesn't follow the law. We don't get into these jobs, we care about that stuff. Judges care about how they're viewed by their fellow judges. We want to be respected. We also have a bunch of law clerks, very smart young people, a heck of a lot smarter than we are, working with us. And they're not going to put up with, they can't veto what we want to do, but they're not going to roll over if we say, well, the facts are this way and the law's that way, but I really like this lawyer a little better, so let's rule for them. No way. That doesn't happen. We want to be respected by the appellate courts that review our homework and our other colleagues, and we want to be respected by the public. So there are all sorts of formal institutional checks and informal institutional checks that I think guide us and keep us from just doing whatever it is that we want. So this idea that judges just make it up, I think is it's really incorrect, and it undermines the nature of our profession. And one thing that contributes to it is, as you read anytime you read in the newspaper or any other media about a judge making a high-profile decision, a federal judge making a high-profile decision, what you will see is Judge William Smith, who was appointed by George W. Bush, or a Bush appointee, and you'll read, and Judge so-and-so, an Obama appointee, as if the president that appointed us is a surrogate for how we view the law and how we will decide the case. That's a complete fallacy, but the media continues to do it. Every story you read, and almost every story you read, a federal judge making an important decision, you will see a description of which president appointed them. So this is a problem of perception, and one that I think we need to work against in trying to get the public to understand that's really not how it works.
Josh, can I rip off of that?
Absolutely.
Because there are things that there are riptide currents in the judiciary in the last decade that have changed that a little bit, and I think Will and Deb would probably agree in that historically, the political affiliation or involvement in politics has not been an unusual thing when it comes to appointment of federal judges and state judges. But that by itself isn't necessarily a negative. I mean, if you think about it, smart people who are interested in their communities and what's happening in their communities are often people who are involved in politics and being active, and so they're part of the folks who would be potentially good jurists. But it's been rare in my lifetime that people who then receive those appointments, notwithstanding the fact that they may have been involved in politics, that they turn into some ideologue on the bench. They're people that understand what their oath requires of them, and they leave that behind. Not to say that they may not continue to carry particular beliefs about different matters in the public sphere, but they know that that isn't something that should change how the law would otherwise call on them to rule. In the federal system, for a long time, the American Bar Association has had a committee, a standing committee, that has made recommendations on persons nominated for Article III judgeships. That's the district judges, the appellate, the Court of Appeals judges, and the Supreme Court justices. And they go through a very thorough process. Judge Smith would have gone through this process, and of talking to people in the community, talking to attorneys, talking to other judges, interviewing the nominee and others. And they make an assessment. Has this person had the experience that one needs to really do the work of a federal judge? Do they have the temperament? Do they have the intellect? Do they have, are they folks that have followed the rules when it comes to how one properly practices law? And then they make these recommendations, and historically they've been important. And the Trump administration said, don't bother with any of that. They didn't want to hear any of that. Biden administration has said, I don't know that we're all that interested in that. And whether as a product of that or untempered by that, I think the public at large understandably feels that judicial nominations on the federal level in some spheres has taken on more of a ideology kind of litmus test. And that's serious stuff for confidence in the judiciary. And well, where does the fault lie? I submit to you the fault lies in the executive branch that chooses to take such a course and doesn't view the appointment of judges as being something that the most important thing is, that this person has the characteristics of being a really, really good judge and not being a ideological lackey. And that's a pejorative, I guess, and it's not. But that's where it starts. And so that's where the other branches of government have such an important part in maintaining the the confidence in the third branch as well. And in recent times, the most obvious demonstration of that is the Federalist Society, which is a group that espouses a particular ideology when it comes to the law, and particularly the law as it relates to particular types of issues, and to the point where they're ingratiated in certain quarters of government, and to the point where they have kind of a standing list of people that have the approved stamp on them. Well, the other place that I've seen that happen, and I suspect it will, and Deb, if she hasn't, she will, is so when I was in the last 5 or 6 years as a judge, I would get applications from students seeking a clerkship in my court. I noticed that lots of them, I shouldn't say lots of them, but many of them were putting in the organizations they belong, Federalist, the Student Federalist Society. And to me, that was nothing more than a flag. Say, here's how I think, and so I want you to know how I think, because in case you want me to think that way in the work I do in the court, then you know, because I'm wagging the flag here. And I didn't like that. Now, there's a group on the other side of the ideological spectrum as well, and so, but they're not quite so prominently involved in all of this. And there's uneasiness in the judiciary ranks about judges being involved with either of those groups, and particularly if they're deeply involved with those groups. So I view that as another problem in the soup, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. Sorry, I repped more than a little bit.
No, thank you.
I think of it as jazz, right? I can just go on and on.
Josh, your question was kind of that judicial opinions are made by human beings with different worldviews. And my response to that is, that's good. That's a good thing. Having a diverse bench means that you're representing everyone, and that people that come before you know that they can be represented. I am the second woman to serve on the federal bench ever in Idaho, and I take that seriously. For a long time, we didn't have any women on the bench, and all of our judges are great, but I can tell you, not seeing a woman, just as an example, on the bench mattered to me, because I wanted to see that that was possible. There was a career path there. And I'm telling you that having a different face sitting up on the bench looking at you, having maybe a different worldview, I think that engenders trust. That tells people that we are representing everyone that comes before us, that we may have, or we may not have, the same worldview as you, but we are here to listen, and we can have empathy and consideration and all the biases and experiences. That makes us a better judiciary. I don't think it's something that's bad. A related topic that I wanted to just touch on quickly is that of judicial independence. And that is a concept that a judge has the freedom to decide a case before him or her based just on the facts and the law, free from outside pressures, politics, or special interests. And I have this great quote about judicial independence, and it's from the Tennessee Supreme Court Justice Adolfo Birch Jr. And that quote is, "Judicial independence is the judge's right to do the right thing, or believing it to be the right thing to do the wrong thing." And I think that's really what a good judge is. Somebody that comes from maybe a diverse background, that tries their best based on everything they know and everything that's presented to them to do the right thing based on everything they know. And so maybe we get it wrong, but that's why it goes upstairs. That's why we have the system to check on everybody. But just to your fundamental point about different people being on the bench with different worldviews, I think that makes the judiciary stronger and should give more trust to those that come before us.
Great. So, so far we've been sort of talking about the judiciary and judges as part of a sort of a unitary system, but of course there's different levels. One of the things that I think is interesting and might relate to the concept of trust is the selection process for judges. So in our panel, we have an Article III judge who is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and has life tenure. We have 2 federal magistrates who are selected through a different process, and maybe Judge Gresham, you could explain that process. Then Judge Bush was a state court judge, which in Idaho are elected positions. Sometimes they're appointed when there's a vacancy, but then the judges need to run for re-election, even our Supreme Court judges in Idaho. So Judge Smith, maybe you could start by offering your thoughts on the relationship between the selection process for these different positions and how that either contributes to or detracts from trust.
Well, there are two ways that generally the judges are selected. One is the appointment process in the federal system by the president, confirmation by the Senate, and as Josh described, the magistrate judges are selected by the district judges. But federal district judges and appeals court judges, Supreme Court justices, have life tenure, which means they can only be removed by impeachment of Congress for impeachable offenses. In many states, we have elected judges, and those elections take various forms. I have seen both sides of this because my father was an elected trial court judge here in Idaho for most of his career. So when I was a little kid, I would go around every 4 years and hand out palm cards and pamphlets. Remember when my dad first ran for the district court, or for the probate court, actually, here in Ada County. He ran against someone who was in their 70s, and the taglines were young, energetic, and something else. 4 years later, they were experienced and seasoned, so forth. So I saw up close and personal what it was to be an elected judge, because I lived through it every 4 years. We didn't know if my dad was going to have a job, and it went from contested elections to retention elections, which was a terrific move. And if you look around the country, you see a variety of systems. Some, I think most states now follow what is known as the Missouri Plan, which is in Idaho follows a modified Missouri Plan, I believe. Judge Weatherall will be able to tell us, or Judge Bush could tell us if that's exactly right. But a more merit-based selection process and then retention elections that follow. Now, some would argue that the elected judge model is a more responsive system, more responsive to the public. Others would say that you get more judicial independence, as Judge Grisham was described, by having judges appointed for life. You don't have to worry about standing for election. I think by and large, judges in our courts, both federal and state judges, take their oaths absolutely seriously. They make the decisions that they think should be made on the law, and they will do that in the face of the possibility that if they're a state court judge in an elected jurisdiction, in the face of the possibility that it might cost them their job. Now, are there exceptions to that? Of course, there are. I think the bigger problem in states where you have elections is what it forces the judges to do in order to get elected. The latest example of that, the best example, is what we saw in Wisconsin in the election for the state Supreme Court. Probably the most important election of any official that you may never have heard of unless you really were watching the news, was the election of I can't pronounce her name, but Justice P, I'll call her, in Wisconsin. But the campaign didn't do a lot to assure the public about the integrity of the judicial system. It got ugly, and so many outside interest groups got involved. There was so much money flowing. If you go on the internet and just Google judicial election commercials, you'll be astounded about the kinds of commercials that have run in Iowa, in Michigan, Wisconsin. You watch these commercials and it doesn't make you feel good about how the public is going to perceive the judiciary. But I would, if we could dictate what it would be, I would suggest that an appointed system with life tenure the federal system is probably the better system. But it's a debate has been going on for a long time. I don't think it's really going to change. We're going to have a lot of elected jurisdictions, and I think the real objective ought to be to try to keep those elections as focused on the issues as possible.
So Judge Gresham, I think the process that you recently went through is one that's probably not well known outside the federal bar. So perhaps you could explain that, because I think it's one that actually has the potential to build trust if the public knew more about it.
Yeah, so I've been on the bench for about a year and a half. I don't know why this is so loud all of a sudden. Let's get back. So I've been on the bench about a year and a half, and I don't have life tenure. I have been appointed to my position for a term of 8 years, subject to being re-upped at the end of those 8 years. And I went through what's called the merit selection panel. And so when there was an opening on the court notified everybody, and it went out nationally that you could apply for this position. So you filled out an application, you sent it in, and a merit selection panel was nominated and put together by our current judges. So they selected folks from all over the state, lawyers, members of the public, and lawyers from all, like criminal, civil, private practice, public servants. So try to get a really really good mix of folks on that merit selection panel. A number of people applied, like I think 84 people applied, including, and I've been practicing for a long time. I thought I knew everybody in the state. There was like 8 or 10 people that applied from out of state that I had never heard of. And it was just because there was an opening on the federal bench in Idaho, and people were like, Idaho sounds great. I'd love to be a federal judge. And so there was a whole lot of people. From that, I think 84 people that applied, the merit selection panel then put all of those names out to every member of the Idaho State Bar to review, and to review on a whole number of categories, judicial temperament, experience, knowledge, all these different things, to try to get an assessment from as many working members of the bar as to what they thought of these applicants. Based on that bar poll and the applications, then that merit selection panel chose 10 people to interview. And I think there were like 14 people on this merit selection panel. So all 10 people came in at your appointed time, and you sat in a room, a horseshoe room with 14 people, and you answered their questions, any and all questions that they may have. It might have come from something someone said in the bar poll. It may have been about your experience. After that process, they selected the top 5, and then those 5 individuals went and were interviewed by our Board of Judges. And Board of Judges just means all of the judges on the District of Idaho. We have 2 district court judges, 2 magistrate judges, and 2 bankruptcy judges. So the 5 of you interviewed in front of, now, it's bad enough when you're a lawyer and you have one federal judge asking you questions. You go into this room and you have 6 people that you've been in front of that you very much respect asking you questions. Thankfully, it was, I can't believe I'm going to say this out loud, it was a fun process because it was much more like a conversation. because these folks knew me. I had been practicing for many years in front of many of them. I had served the court in various capacities. And so now in hindsight, I realized that was a really good thing and that interview went well. After they interviewed the 5, then the chief judge of our district, Judge David Nye, called. And so I had an interview in the morning. I remember going, I'm done. I don't know. This is my best shot. I was literally, this is my very famous, where were you when you learned you were going to be a federal judge? I was picking up a Papa Murphy's pizza for my son to go home because I just didn't have the mental, ability to cook dinner. And I was driving up Harrison on the way home with a Papa Murphy's pizza, and I get a call from my secretary at the time saying, Judge Nye is on the phone, he's trying to get you, where are you? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm at Papa Murphy's. And so that's my special moment. And so I pulled over and Judge Nye called, and it was thankfully a pretty quick decision. They had met, as soon as the interviews were over, they had made a decision, and luckily I was able to get there. But it's a merit selection panel, and so now I have been appointed for 8 years. At the end of that 8 years, guess what? Another panel gets appointed to review basically what I've been up to and to put out another bar poll to see if I should be re-upped for another term. So it's like you keep getting a report card over and over. And so hopefully at the end of those 8 years, people will review what I have done and think that I deserve to continue. But my position is much different than a district judge, because I don't have life tenure, and really my bosses are the district judges. And so, but even so, I'm the luckiest girl ever because I got the best job in the world. So I'm very excited about it.
Thank you. Judge Bush, anything you want to add about either the federal bench or being a state judge?
Well, the state position follows a similar sort of process. If you are being considered by appointment under the rules that existed then, the judicial council is involved in interviewing applicants. A similar sort of survey is done of anyone in the bar, the bench, or the community that wants to weigh in, and then the judicial council that makes a recommendation. At that time, it was to be a minimum of 2 and not more than 4 candidates who they deemed to be qualified to the governor, and then the governor makes an appointment. So inescapably, there's political considerations in all of that. But it's worked well. It's a modified Missouri plan is what it's known as. The legislature has tinkered with it. And the legislature wants to have more say in who comes out of that process, because there's been some disgruntled legislators about how that appointment process works. And that's worrisome to me, and I suspect worrisome to a number of people in the bar. And I think that the election process, in some instances, just reaches its lowest common denominator and becomes, as Judge Smith says, sometimes an ugly process. And fortunately, there have only been a handful of instances that I can think of in Idaho where it was an election process that had some characteristics that weren't as good as they could be. In other states, such as Texas and Nevada, the elections become contests in the trial amongst trial lawyers about who's plaintiffs and who's defense oriented, and they try to get people on the bench who they think are predisposed to favor one or the other. So that isn't the best either. There is no perfect approach. The one that probably has the end result of having folks in a position for a long time that are more likely or very likely to be good judges is the federal system, I think. That's all I'd add.
Thank you. So let's maybe raise the I guess, scope of what we're talking about to a national level, and talk about the Supreme Court. which of course are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and have life tenure. Supreme Court's been in the news a lot recently, so perhaps the panelists would like to talk about trust in the Supreme Court, because as was mentioned, under Marbury versus Madison, what the Supreme Court says goes, but these are 9 individuals appointed at different points in time by different presidents, with different predilections, I guess I'd say, and leave it at that. So do any of our judges want to start out on that topic?
Well, I'll jump right into the fire here a little bit. So one of the problems that we have with respect to this larger topic of trust in the judiciary is that the Supreme Court occupies such an enormous place in our culture and in our government. It has an outsized importance, and it is everything about the Supreme Court is how the public sort of views the judiciary. I think by and large, the public bases its feeling about the judiciary starting with the Supreme Court. And then from there, they think a little bit from time to time about decisions that courts of appeals and district courts make. Maybe there's a high-profile trial, or there's a big criminal case with an important crime or defendant, and they pay attention to that. They pay attention to on the same degree what goes on in the state courts, but they really, really focus on the Supreme Court. And so, what do they see when they look at the Supreme Court? Well, they see a confirmation process that is, I think, without question, is just really broken. It looks completely political. It looks non-substantive. Judges, nominees, they take the party line. They say, I can't comment about all these important issues that are going to come before the court. They say how they revere precedent, and then they get on the court and they do what they do, and the public looks at that and says, well, that confirmation process is a mess. They look at the Merrick Garland nomination and they see a highly qualified nominee who couldn't get a hearing, and then Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies, and they see how President Trump rushed Amy Coney Barrett onto the court with the help of Mitch McConnell. Now, Amy Coney Barrett is an extremely well-qualified person, lawyer, highly intelligent. She's a very good judge, but the public looks at that and says, well, how is that not political? It just looks so political. Well, it is political. And they infer from that, if the process is that political, then the court must be political. And from that, then judges must be political, okay? The other problem that we have, I think, with the Supreme Court is that historically, we have venerated them to a much greater degree than we should. And I say historically, I mean in recent history. All of us in this room, even the older ones in this room, have grown up in sort of the post-Warren Court era. We think of the court as a court that vindicates individual rights, because that's what the Warren Court did, and to a degree the Burger Court in the 1970s, following on the Warren Court. So all of these individual rights that the Supreme Court is established, Brown versus Board of Education, maybe the most important decision in the history of the court. Numerous decisions in the area of criminal law, the Miranda case, which I'm sure some of you even the students have heard about the Miranda case and the Gideon versus Wainwright and other cases that have protect individual rights in the criminal context. These all happened during the Warren and early Burger Court era. And we think of the court as that's what it does. And then when the court changes, as it has, and it begins to engage in what we sometimes call law shifting, changing the law, revoking precedent, like they did in Dobbs, and rejecting the holding of Roe versus Wade and Casey. And they do it in a kind of radical way, that is a complete overturning of a prior precedent, rather than, as the Chief Justice emphasized in his opinion in Dobbs, we should be moving more incrementally. When the court moves radically, people look at that and say, well, what was that? We had a right for 50 years and now we don't have a right. So how can they help but think, well, that's just a political decision, not a legal decision, all right? But now I'll just make one last point, which is, I think we need to understand the Supreme Court in a larger historical context, not just in the context of from the Warren Court forward. The Supreme Court has made a lot of really terrible decisions in the course of its history. It is the U.S. Supreme Court that decided Dred Scott, that said blacks could not be citizens. The Supreme Court endorsed the internment of Japanese in the Karematsu case. It was the Supreme Court in the Lochner decision in 1905 that said that states could not regulate child labor. And in Buck versus Bell, the Supreme Court said it was okay to sterilize women who were of lower intelligence. All right? So if you think about the Supreme Court in its larger historical context, I think it's fair to conclude that, well, they don't always get it right. They get it wrong a lot of the time. And it takes Congress, it takes the executive, it takes a new court over a longer period of time to correct error. Right now, we're in a period of time where the court is changing a lot, changing a lot of law. And we can talk about, you agree or disagree with what they are doing, but it sends a message, an unfortunate message, that what they're doing is political, and it makes it much more difficult for us to trust the judiciary.
I would agree completely with everything what Judge Smith just said. I'd emphasize that the nature of the confirmation process in the last decade only serves to exacerbate public concern and then public cynicism when decisions that are related to matters highlighted in confirmation hearings are then the subject of decisions, and Dobbs' case certainly being front and center in that. And I want to talk about the individual justice's responsibility for a second, but I posit this question because it's something that I've pondered from time to time in recent years about the enormity of the court's impact upon the country, sometimes negatively, like the cases that Will's just described, more often positively. But imagine for a moment if the court took the same position with its decisions that invalidated state prohibitions against interracial marriage, that prohibited using contraceptives. Any number of those that we think of now as just how could you even think for a moment that it would be anything other than what it is today? And if the court were to say, as it did in Dobbs, those will be matters for the states to decide. Imagine that if that had been the decision when those cases were first before the court, and how different our country might look today. It's really kind of stark. But when we talk about the individual justices, Justice Amy Coney Barrett has recently come out and been the first justice, I think, I know for sure, has said, yeah, we need a code of ethics that applies to us as well, just as it does to all other federal judges. And it really is, those people that sit on the court have to be so acutely aware, sensitive to, and not doing things that would lead to people thinking that they're going to make decisions for anything other than the case in front of them on the law for the right reasons. And there have been things that have been happening in recent years that aren't that way. And so in my mind, at least some of that, the fault lies with the individual. And at its heart, every position of public trust that we have in our country has this enormous degree of individual responsibility. And I think of sheriffs in Idaho who state publicly, well, I'm not going to enforce those laws because they're unconstitutional. As if the sheriff gets to decide that, as opposed to his or her oath that says, I'm going to uphold the Constitution. The Constitution says the judiciary decides those things. And other public officials that take the similar sort of position aren't the federal court, and I'm not on the court anymore, but we used to get lots of slings and arrows thrown at us from the legislature for decisions that we'd made at different times regarding Idaho legislation. And there was one instance in which one particular legislator talked about those know-nothing liberal federal judges, I forget what other kind of, not cruel things, but just intimating that we didn't know what we were doing. And I really wanted to go find this fellow and visit with him because I grew up in Idaho Falls. My father was a career principal. The last school he taught at's named after him. Or my grandfather. My father was a longtime lawyer, a former legislator, former county prosecutor. And this legislator, who also was a redhead, this legislator was serving in the same district that my father served in the legislature. He was a teacher in the same school district that my grandfather was a principal in. He'd grown up in Idaho Falls, attended the same high school that I attended. And I wanted to go introduce myself to him and say, so which part of our particular backgrounds makes me some know-nothing liberal federal judge? Or is it possible that perhaps having gone to law school and practiced law and paid attention to such things that maybe I can make decisions that are worth reading carefully? So some of that is just kind of giving respect, just respecting each other, and that's missing a lot.
So we have about 5 minutes left, 4 technically. So I wanted to pivot from maybe our prescriptions on the problems to what can be done about it. And so Judge Gresham and all of our panelists, what can judges do? What can the courts do? What can other institutions do? I know that I think Judge Smith mentioned Congress, right? The role that Congress has, or the state legislature has. What can folks like our audience in this room, students, teachers, other public servants, business folks? So maybe choose one or two of those groups and offer your thoughts, please.
Sure. So just to start, so as judges, we're very limited in what we can say or do about anything. So how do we earn trust? Trust is earned, right? And so the way that a judge, and it is up to each individual judge, is to exemplify trust and ethics. As a magistrate judge at the bottom of the poll, I have ridiculously comprehensive financial disclosures and ethics things that I have to complete every year. And if I make any certain transaction over $1,000 in a month, I must report that within that month, or I'm subject to significant penalties. I am subject to significant ethical and financial concerns. I willingly do that. It's a lot, but we do it. I think judges make transparent decisions, both orally and in writing. Write clearly, write simply, but articulate the reason for your decision. People can disagree with you, but at least give them the reasoning. Again, going back to judicial independence, I may get it wrong, but I'm trying my best, and here's the thing. So it builds trust about how did a judge get there. I think omit inflammatory language in decisions, anything political. Some judges with life tenure perhaps are able to put kind of their spin on a case. I am currently handling a couple of high-profile things. I am very cognizant of the fact that I am not a policymaker. I am applying the law as best as I can in a neutral and fair way. No inflammatory language. I hope that builds trust with people. And one point I really want to make, especially for the students, is we keep talking about what is our society, what we're doing, and we're not going to throw it all on your shoulders, but it is a lot on your shoulders moving forward. Be engaged in democracy. Being here means that you're already interested in it, and continue to do so. Look for opportunities in public service. The people that are most interested in it and are willing to serve are only going to make our country better. And in particular, in the judiciary, I encourage you to pursue a career in law. It is very satisfying, and if you choose to do so, even pursue a job in the judiciary. There is no better way I can do right now to give back to my community as to be that watchdog for liberty and really take that very seriously. So I encourage all of you, especially students, to pursue public service, pursue a career in law. In my chambers, I look specifically for law clerks to give Idaho students an ability to have a federal clerkship, because we don't have that many federal judges in Idaho. We have a lot of kids from Idaho that are interested in it. I think it makes a lot of sense for us to try and give some opportunities there. So I encourage all of you to pursue a career. It is very satisfying.
Thank you, Judge Smith.
Well, let me just say this. First, when it comes to the Supreme Court, I think you're going to see some real action soon. The court works by consensus. The Chief Justice is a very powerful man, but every chief judge, I've been a chief judge in my district, will tell you that being a chief judge is sort of like walking in the graveyard. There are a lot of people underneath you, but nobody is listening. And that's kind of how I think the Chief Justice, he's the Chief Justice, but he has to work by consensus of the court. Behind the scenes, there is a lot going on. The court realizes that, as the comic strip says, we've met the enemy and it is us. The justices and administrators in the court are not oblivious to this issue. I see some things going on in the background. I won't bore you with the details, but I can tell that things are moving in a direction where I think you're going to see a code of ethics that's going to apply to the Supreme Court justices within a year. That leads to the second problem I would describe about the judiciary. In addition to the issues that the others have talked about in terms of how we're limited in terms of what we can say, our other problem is that we're an analog institution in a digital world. I mean, we may not even be an analog institution. We may be more like a Pony Express institution in a digital world. We don't move quickly. We don't move quickly. The law doesn't move quickly, and sometimes it does. The Dobbs decision is an example, but usually it takes years and years for the law to evolve. Dobbs is a great example. It's going to evolve in ways that people did not envision at the time. It's going to evolve in the states. That's what's going to happen. We don't react well. We're not positioned to respond to all the things that are happening in terms of criticism of the judiciary in the real time that it happens. It's a real challenge for us. We usually express ourselves in our writing, in our opinions from the bench, but we can do more. And one of the things we can do is get out here and talk in programs like this. Judges need to be out in the public trying to explain the work of the judiciary. The other thing we need to do is work with educational institutions, colleges and high schools, and helping the teachers understand how you can teach about what the courts do. We can do better at opening our courts, bringing students and the public into our courts, and not making them inaccessible through so many barriers that it takes to get into court. It would be wonderful if we could put cameras in the courtrooms in the federal courts. That's heresy, but I believe it. It goes against a judicial conference policy. But we rely a lot on the bar, on the legal academic world, and on our educational institutions to try to disseminate what we do, explain how we do it, why we do it. And I think the last thing, and maybe the most important, is that day in and day out, judges need to model the kind of behavior that will give people confidence in the judiciary. And I think you do see some great examples of judges doing that. I'll just cite one example, Judge Chunkin in the District Court of the District of Columbia handling one of the most high-profile cases in history. I think she's doing a terrific job of demonstrating what it is to be a really good, thoughtful, careful judge handling a very difficult situation. And that's what we all need to do in throughout every day our work.
Judge Bush. I know we have -5 minutes, but you'll just bear with me for one. No. In addition to those things that Judge Grasham and Judge Smith have talked about, the other branches of government, and I say this as earnestly as I can say, and then others in the public sphere, if they want to criticize the court for rulings that they may disagree with, that's one thing. And then the slide that was up earlier, there were different examples of things that have happened. And President Obama criticized the Supreme Court in the State of the Union message. He criticized what he's concerned about the result. He didn't call them a bunch of imbeciles in a kangaroo court or things like that. He criticized the result. The other instances were not. They were not fair play, so to speak. So these gratuitous ad hominem attacks on judges that are intended to leave the impression that somehow the judiciary and the judges handling cases are incompetent or biased or otherwise not going to be fair is insidious to public confidence, and that needs to stop. And instead, public comments about such things, if they want to comment, they can say, well, we respectfully disagree. We understand that's the role of the judiciary to handle these things. And if it's a trial court matter, they can say, and we'll probably ask the appellate court to take another look at it. And that's all that needs to be said, because anything more than that that's not focused is problematic. And then it's going to be critical for the generation of the students who are in this room to think carefully about those things and to take heed of what we've had to say. And I look around the room and see so many friends and lawyers I know, and we're singing to the choir already on such things. But we are at a kind of pivot point, and if we don't start to respond affirmatively to these sorts of challenges, then I worry that we may have permanent damage done. So the fact that you're here is comforting to me. So thank you for that.
And on that note, I will add my thanks for everyone's attendance and attention, and how about a round of applause for our panelists?
Thanks for having me.
And for the students here, thank you especially for coming. And I think this afternoon we'll have the opportunities hopefully to chat a little bit more in depth. So thank you all very much.
Judges, thank you. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, great to meet you in person.
All right, same here.
Thanks for your patience.
is the author of the recently released book, The Last Honest Man, which tells the story of Frank Church's life, and in particular, it really digs deep into Frank Church's oversight of what became known as the Church Committee. And it is just a really terrific opportunity and such a neat thing for Idaho and Senator Church and the legacy of Senator Church to just be in the national spotlight like this, and to have a reporter like Mr. Risen come and share this time to talk us through what he found and what he learned, and what we can really be proud of as people who live in Idaho, and the legacy of what happened in the 1970s and 1980s. Mr. Risen is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winning author. He has written several books, and he takes very seriously his role as a guardian of the public trust, and what it means to have a fourth branch of government that speaks or that serves on behalf of you and me. I studied journalism and mass communication at one point, and it was really drilled into my head that what makes journalism fun, but also what makes it essential, is that journalisms are granted a privilege the rest of us are not, which is that very often they get to be in the room, right? They get to be in the Oval Office. They get to be in the press briefing room. They get to go on Air Force One. They get to stand in the back room with people and hear secrets and guard those secrets, but tell them in a way that helps us make the choices as a people we need to make. And that privilege of doing things and being in the room is something that Mr. Risen takes seriously. And it's been clear to me in the time I've been getting to know him that he's not doing it because he wants to be important. He's not doing it for himself. He's doing it for you, and he's doing it for me, and he's doing it because he wants us to know what's happening. And so I really appreciate him. I appreciate his service, and I hope that you will get as much out of listening to him as I have over the last few days. So, Mr. Risen, I turn the time over to you.
Thanks for that introduction, Sam. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me here. And I've been in Idaho over the last few days, and I really appreciate the very warm welcome I've received. And I've really enjoyed the fact that a lot of people have read the book and seem to enjoy it. And I really feel good about writing a book about a good man. I've spent most of my life as a reporter writing about bad people doing bad things, and it was refreshing to write about a good man who tried to do good things, and that was what is one of the things that attracted me to writing about Frank Church, and it's fascinating to really dig into his life. I didn't really know much about his life when I started working on the book, and what I've told this story before, but I think it's important to understand how I got interested in Frank Church and the Church Committee. I covered the CIA for the New York Times for many years, and for other news organizations, and every time I started talking to CIA people, they would say, if you ask them why they did certain things the way they did, they would say, well, this is how we've done it since the Church Committee. And then if you ask them about illegal things that they had done in the past, you would say, well, we stopped doing that when the Church Committee came around. And so it became clear to me fairly quickly as I was covering the CIA that the Church Committee represented like a watershed in the history of not only the CIA, but the entire intelligence community and really the entire government. It had, for the very first time, imposed the rule of law on the CIA and on other agencies like the FBI and the NSA. It was the very first congressional investigation of the intelligence community. It was the first investigation of the CIA and the FBI and the NSA. And it was, you have to get back into the mindset of the mid-1970s to really understand its significance. That prior to the Church Committee in 1975, there had never been any oversight of the Central Intelligence Agency. It had operated for 30 years. It was created in 1947. It had operated with no congressional oversight, no independent oversight of any kind. They only reported to the president, and they did that very haphazardly and on an ad hoc basis. They only told the president what he asked and what he wanted to know about. There was no House or Senate intelligence committees as there are today. There were no laws governing the operations of the CIA or the FBI or the NSA. It was, as a result, for the first 30 years of the CIA's existence, it engaged in a wide range of illicit and illegal operations in total secrecy. The FBI had had become a cult of personality of J. Edgar Hoover, who was the only director in its history until his death, just before the Church Committee. And so it had taken on the personality of J. Edgar Hoover, who was paranoid and racist and saw communists under every tree stump. There was at the NSA, as far as most Americans knew, didn't exist. It was operating, it had been created in 1952, more than 20 years before the Church Committee. There had never been a single congressional hearing about the NSA. The NSA director had never testified in public before the Church Committee. It was widely known as no such agency. And so the idea of the Church Committee was revolutionary at the time. To think that a congressional committee could actually force the intelligence community to open up and admit to its many abuses over the past 30 or 40 years was unheard of. And as a result, Frank Church and the Church Committee encountered incredible obstacles to their work. 3 of their witnesses were murdered. And it was, the efforts to silence the committee really climaxed in late 1975 with the assassination of the CIA's Athens station chief by a Greek terrorist organization. Even though the Ford White House, which was opposed to the Church Committee's efforts, knew that the CIA's, the assassination in Athens had nothing to do with the Church Committee, they spread the word that Frank Church was responsible for the assassination because they were trying to destroy and discredit the Church Committee. One of the things I've done in the book was actually recreate exactly what happened in Athens with the first ever interview with the deputy station chief in Athens, who admitted that the truth about what happened and that the Church Committee had nothing to do with it, and that he had reported accurately back to Washington what happened, and that the CIA and the Ford White House lied about it anyway. And that had a real important impact on the Church Committee's legacy. But I think today we now see, 40 years later, 50 years later almost, that the church committee's legacy has grown. It's not shrunken. The funny thing was that in the years immediately after the church committee, it was largely forgotten, as all of the attacks against it had some effect. And then in the 1980s and 90s, it kind of faded into obscurity. But it really was 9/11 and the renewed attacks against Frank Church and the church committee after 9/11 by Dick Cheney and the Bush White House that revived and ironically revived the memory of Frank Church and the church committee. Dick Cheney, who had been Deputy White House Chief of Staff in the Ford administration in 1975 when the church committee was operating, and he tried to convince President Ford to fight back against the church committee, not to cooperate in any way with it, not to give them any classified information, not to grant them interviews. But Gerald Ford had been made president without ever being elected because Richard Nixon had just been forced to resign in 1974 after a Supreme Court decision ordered him to turn over White House tapes to Congress. And so Gerald Ford was no fool. He didn't want to fight with Congress right after Nixon had been forced out of office for the same thing. And so he ignored Dick Cheney and cooperated to a limited degree with the church committee. And William Colby, the CIA director at the time, also cooperated with the church committee, actually much more than the White House realized. And when they realized he was cooperating more than they thought, they fired him in late 1975. But Dick Cheney never forgot the humiliation he felt by the fact that he was ignored at the White House and that the church committee had actually gotten enormous amounts of information out of this CIA and the Ford White House and had investigated a wide range of CIA and FBI abuses and NSA abuses. And so in 2001, right after the September 11th attacks, Cheney began to blame 9/11 on Frank Church and ignoring the fact that Frank Church had been dead since 1984 and that the church committee had taken place in 1975. And he said that it was all that the U.S. intelligence community had failed on 9/11 because of the limitations and the restrictions on their ability to operate imposed by the church committee. And he continued to rant about Frank Church and the church committee for years after 9/11, even as the war in Iraq went bad and the disclosures of the Bush administration's excesses came out about torture and illegal domestic spying and other activities, black sites, things like that. And so as the war in Iraq went bad and as all these other disclosures came out, more and more people realized, well, if Dick Cheney didn't like Frank Church, maybe he was a good guy. And so there were increasing calls in the few years after 9/11 for a new church committee to investigate the Bush administration, which was the irony of Dick Cheney reviving the memory of Frank Church. And that continued for several years. And the idea of a new church committee became part of the American political lexicon as it became a new synonym for a truth and reconciliation committee or commission that could, and anytime there is a big scandal in Washington, that you could have some major investigation in order to mend the wounds of the country. And that it became such a powerful synonym for a major congressional investigation that as soon as Dick Cheney began to fade from the scene, the Republicans started talking about a new church committee to investigate the supposed efforts by the intelligence community to go after Donald Trump. The idea that the intelligence community was going after Donald Trump was absurd, but it was a powerful driver on the right politically. And so this year, the right-wing Republicans have claimed that their new House Weaponization Committee by Jim Jordan has actually called it the New Church Committee. And so we now see that both sides want a new church committee for very different reasons. But it just shows the power of the synonym, the power of the name the church committee has taken on in the United States today. It's become a part of our political language in a way that Frank Church would be shocked, I think, if he understood that. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about how Frank Church got to the church committee. I think as I wrote the book, it became clear to me that I don't think Frank Church ever realized that the one thing that he would be, or one of the things he would be remembered for, was the church committee. I think he thought he would be remembered maybe for being chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But in fact, he's primarily remembered for chairing the first investigation of the CIA. And I think that his background really helps explain how he got to that point. He was born here in Boise in 1924. And I think he's I think a lot of people who don't know much about him thought that maybe he was a boring character, but the more you dive into his life, the more complex you see he was. He was born into a family, a fairly average family. His father owned a sporting goods store here in Boise. His grandfather had been the first Frank Church in Idaho. He was the chief assayer for the gold mines that were led to a lot of the first gold rush in Idaho. He came out almost fully formed. He was as a child prodigy in school. When he was in junior high school, famously wrote a letter to the editor of the Capital, I think it was the Capital News. It's a newspaper that doesn't exist here in Boise anymore. But he wrote a long, very elegant letter defending Senator William Borah, who was the senator from Idaho, a Republican who was an isolationist. And he defended him on his for his isolationist views. And when the editor of the newspaper read it, he thought it was such a great letter, he wanted to publish it on the front page of the newspaper. But he couldn't believe it was written by like a 14-year-old. And so he checked, and the teachers said, yes, that's Frank Church. And they published the letter, and people wrote in saying, it can't possibly have been written by a junior high school kid. Frank Church's father yelled at him for sending the letter in without asking for his permission. So it was, and then a couple of years later, he had a power of the spoken word that it's hard to figure out where he got that other than from just private practice. He would speak into the mirror at home in his bathroom, and he developed a kind of perfect diction that everyone throughout his life talked about. And when he was in high school, he competed in the American Legion Oratory Contest, which is maybe the biggest, at the time, it was like the largest debating competition in the country. And
he won the regional, state and regional contests, and then went to the national contest in Charleston, South Carolina. And he gave a speech that was really remarkable for a high school kid, talking, this is a couple years later after his letter about Bora, and he gave this speech about the importance of defending democracy at a time when Nazism and fascism were rising. And he also talked about the importance of not allowing powerful economic interests to take advantage of the rising need for war. And so it was an incredibly balanced and nuanced speech that really mirrored Franklin Roosevelt's For Freedom speech, which had been given a few months earlier. And he tried to show in a way that I think really defined his life how important it was for a liberal democracy to both defend democracy in the world, but also defend itself against the rising power of powerful economic interests. It's something, you can find that letter, that speech online today, but it's really, I recommend reading it. It's, you don't see too many 16-year-old kids writing or giving a speech like that. He won the contest easily, and it got him a scholarship to Stanford. And he went back to Boise, became student body president at Boise High School, because he was not only really smart, he was also popular, which is kind of annoying for the rest of us. He then, after Pearl Harbor, decided to go to Stanford anyway, despite the war starting. And then after a year, he entered the Army and ended up as an Army intelligence officer in China near the end of the war. In 1945, he was an intelligence, he was working on intelligence order of battle issues. The U.S. Army had what was called the Chinese Combat Command, which was the Army's efforts to help the Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime's army fight the Japanese in mainland China. And he was a lieutenant, and one day the main briefer for the commanding general of the Chinese Combat Command couldn't do his daily briefing, and somebody came around and said, can anybody else do the briefing? And he said, yeah, I can do it. And so he did it so well that he got the job permanently, and he was kind of like Lou Gehrig taking over from Wally Pipp. He was, and he really excelled at briefing and explaining events and providing analysis. And but the commanding general also loved his diction, and he kind of treated Church, who was really, I think he was only 20 at the time, he treated him almost like his pet, and he would bring him to dinners of senior officers and just ask him to read or speak because he loved listening to his diction. And he later said that he had the best diction in the Army. And he awarded Church a Bronze Star for his work. And I think it's difficult not to see that he did it mainly because he liked listening to him talk. After the war, he came back to the U.S. He had gotten to know Bethune Clark in high school, who was the daughter of the governor of Idaho. But they'd had a kind of an on-again, off-again relationship throughout high school and the war. And she had gotten engaged to another man during the war. He came back and realized that maybe she didn't really like her fiance. And so he asked her to marry him, and they agreed to get married if he went back to Stanford and finished up. And he graduated from Stanford, they got married, he went to Harvard Law School, and then transferred back to Stanford Law School, and they had their first son, but in the meantime, he developed cancer. And he nearly died from the cancer, and had very incredible experimental treatments that saved his life. And he came out of that experience really a changed man. He decided that he was going to be willing to take risks in his life in a way that he never would have before. And he and Bethine moved back to Idaho, and he decided to get into politics. And when he was, I think, 32, decided to run for the United States Senate against maybe the worst senator in the history of the United States Senate, Herman Welker, who 2 years earlier had engaged in blackmail against another senator because the other senator's son was a homosexual. And he had threatened the other senator he would expose his son if he didn't resign from the Senate. And instead, that senator committed suicide. And Herman Welker was shameless enough to give the eulogy at the man's funeral. So, and to me, the reason I chose the name The Last Honest Man for this book was in that 1956 Senate race, Frank Church was running against Herman Welker. And Church's staff and some allies came out with they wrote up a pamphlet. It was what we would now call opposition research about Herman Welker that included stuff about his efforts to blackmail the other senator and how it led to his suicide. And when Frank Church read it, he was horrified, and he ordered all of the pamphlets to be burned in a bonfire behind his his campaign office in Boise. And he said, "I don't want to win that way. I want to win on the issues." And I challenge you to find any other candidate today who would do that. And he beat Herman Welker and he became a senator in 1957. And at the time, he was really a pretty conventional Democrat, a Cold Warrior like John Kennedy, who was his friend in the Senate. And when Kennedy became president in 1960, it was the only time Church really had a friend who was a president. He began to really change, though, when he went to Vietnam in 1962 and saw that the war in Vietnam was not much different from what he had seen in China. The South Vietnamese regime reminded him of the incompetence and the corruption of Chiang Kai-shek's regime. And he thought that the war was clearly unwinnable. And he began to talk about the war. And then after Kennedy's assassination and Lyndon Johnson became president, he began to speak much more openly and vocally about his opposition to the war in Vietnam. And he became one of the leading critics of the war and in Congress. And Vietnam really radicalized him. He went from being, I would say, a conventional Cold Warrior into probably one of the most radical senators in modern American history. He began to talk by the late 60s and early 70s about how America was becoming a militaristic empire, how Vietnam was a symptom of a larger problem of the growing power of corporations and the intelligence community to turn America into an imperial power that was constantly at war with and was constantly seeking hegemony over other countries. And he openly compared the U.S. foreign policy to that of the Soviet Union. He said we were no different from the Soviets. And he compared the war in Vietnam to the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, which was really heresy for mainstream American politicians. And so it was remarkable to me that he kept getting reelected in Idaho. And it was, I think, his special talent and his special gift that he was able to Idaho and understand Washington, and to never really compromise his views, even as he tried to explain them to people in Idaho. One of the most remarkable campaigns he gave was in 1968, when he was running for re-election the second time. He'd been reelected in 1962, and then in 1968, he had to get reelected in the most chaotic political year in the 20th century. And it was, he decided not to try to say anything different than he'd been saying about the Vietnam War. And he would go from one county courthouse to another in Idaho and sit down and allow anybody in the county to come up and talk to him. And he would give speeches all over the state about how terrible the war in Vietnam was, how it was radicalized, it was changing the nature of the American Republic, and how we had to end the war. And it was remarkable that he won easily as a result. And it's one of those lessons, a case study in how you have to sometimes trust the voters, that if you tell them the truth and if you explain yourself and you don't try to hide anything, that people will sometimes trust you. And he took from that election a belief that he understood Idaho, that he understood that people could be persuaded. And I think it's something that most politicians today have forgotten about. He then, that 1968 election really emboldened him in Washington, and he went on to push for the cutting off all funds for the war in Vietnam, and having the power of the purse by Congress used to stop military operations. And he did that through a series of legislative measures called the Cooper Church Amendments, which first started with cutting off funding in Thailand, and then cutting off funding in Cambodia, and then finally trying to cut off funding in Vietnam. And the Cooper Church Amendment became part of the political language of the 1960s. It became a shorthand for efforts to stop the war by Congress. And it turned Frank Church really, for the first time in his life, into a political star in Washington. He was constantly on the public affairs TV shows explaining his opposition to the war and how Congress could end the war. And I think today a lot of historians recognize that the growing popularity of the Cooper Church Amendments in Congress, which came increasingly closer to passage and enactment, really had a major impact on Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and forced them to accelerate peace negotiations with North Vietnam and to finally end the war before the Cooper Church Amendments finally gained passage. And hopefully, and possibly, Church knew he might need a veto-proof majority in Congress to convince Nixon, but he was getting closer and closer to final victory on the Cooper Church Amendments. And I think it's fairly obvious that that led Nixon to move more quickly to end the war than he wanted to. And I think there were, one of the great letters that I read during here at Boise State. One of the great treasures you have here are the Frank Church papers. All of his papers are collected in the Albertsons Library. And one of the things that I read there was, I think, a letter saying, thank you for, letter to church saying, thank you for saving my life by ending the war. So it was a moving experience for a lot of young men to think that there was somebody really trying to stop the war. But Vietnam, as I said, really completely radicalized Church. It changed him. By 1970, he was not the same senator he had been in 1960. And he began to push. He was still very deeply frustrated that ending the war had taken so long. And he came to believe that there were deep forces in the country that were pushing the nation into constant state of war, which he thought would also lead to a crushing of dissent in the United States and an end of democracy. And so he wanted to investigate. He wanted to use the power of Congress to investigate both multinational corporations around the world and the CIA and the intelligence community. And he thought that they were like twin forces operating around the world to sabotage American foreign policy and to turn the country into an empire that would not brook dissent either overseas or in the United States. So he created a small subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to investigate multinational corporations and their operations overseas. And it was a small committee, but it had enormous impact at the time. It investigated, first it started with the investigation of ITT's secret work with the CIA to overthrow the government in Chile. The elected president of Chile, who was a socialist, was thinking about nationalizing the telephone system in Chile, and ITT owned the telephone system in the country. And so it collaborated with the CIA to try to overthrow Allende. When Church began to investigate that as part of this multinational investigation, he began to pull the threads on what happened in Chile, and it led him increasingly to look at the CIA and what they were doing around the world. And so within a couple of years, he began to want to pursue a much larger investigation of the CIA. And in 1974, right after Nixon's resignation and the midterm elections, when the Democrats won a landslide victory in Congress, in December 1974, the New York Times published a major expose of CIA operations to spy on American citizens. And their domestic spying story caused a firestorm in the country, and it led for calls in Congress to create a committee to investigate the CIA. And Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, was a Democrat, pushed for the creation of that committee in January 1975. And at first he wanted Senator Phil Hart of Michigan to chair the committee. He was a liberal Democrat who was well liked by conservatives as well. But Hart had cancer, and so he told Mansfield that he couldn't do it, but he told him that you should pick Church. Frank really wants to do this. And at the time, Church was already lobbying Mansfield to chair the committee. The problem for Church was that there were a lot of Senate leaders who really didn't like him because they thought he was too much of a publicity hound and that He would sometimes couldn't be trusted on things that he said. But Mansfield agreed to make him the chairman. It led to probably, as I said earlier, one of the greatest investigations ever of the CIA. The first thing that they investigated was the CIA's efforts to work with the mafia to assassinate foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro, which was an incredible story that had never been told before. The second huge story they uncovered was the FBI's harassment of Martin Luther King. And then I think the third great investigation they had was they exposed the National Security Agency's ability to spy on American citizens and their telecommunications. Those three were the landmark investigations of the Church Committee that really stood the test of time and led to a lot of reforms, legislation, legal reforms, administrative changes, and executive orders that created a new paradigm for the way that the intelligence community operated and led Dick Cheney to be unhappy for many years. So with that, I'll be happy to end. And you want to take questions or something? Or?
We'll do it with the panel.
Okay,
The
great.
breakouts we'll do
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And just as a reminder, Jim's book is for sale out in the lobby, and he will be available throughout the afternoon, and of course our breakout sessions after lunch, where you can sit and hear more of the story and ask questions of Mr. Risen and of all of our panelists. We're not going to break right now. We're going to go into our second panel here in just a second. Just a couple of reminders that lunch will be in Simplot, which is the ballroom around the corner, and we will still stream the keynote speaker in here if you are not attending the lunch. The other thing I just want to mention is that after lunch at 1:15, we will come back in here, and the Boise State Student Body President will address us talking about trust and turbulent times as it relates to young people, especially people in college, before we break to the breakouts. Now, without further ado, I want to invite up our panelists and our moderator, board member, and strategic communication specialist, Scott Perrin, who will talk to us about trust in one of our foundational institutions, the media. So thank you.
eyes adjust. What's that? I said I'm not used to the lights.
Oh, yeah.
My eyes adjust. Hey, nice to meet you in person. Nice to meet you too. How's it going? Yeah. Yeah, how's it going? Hi.
Mia.
Mia, Mark.
Mark, nice to meet you.
Got my cheat sheet here.
Oh my goodness, you guys are so prepared. I just wrote notes from when we met, but they're all messy. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Scott Perrin. Thank you, Monica, for that brief introduction, which is always warranted in this case. I'd like to invite everyone in the room who's under 20 to stand up. Don't sit down yet. No, you don't have to stand up, but I wanted for all of us to have a sense of how much youth and energy there is in the room today. And one of the things we're asked to do today, guys, young ladies and gentlemen, is to give you 2 minutes about how we got into the field of communication or public policy. And so I had a random experience as a teenager that I'll just use to introduce myself a little bit. I grew up loving books. I grew up loving sports. I got to high school. I took the journalism class. That meant I worked on the student newspaper. My dad is a beer and wine wholesaler, so he's at grocery stores topping off shelves and product and all this stuff. Up walks the sports editor of the hometown newspaper where I lived, the Idaho State Journal. And he said, "Bob, is this Scott, is he your son?" And my dad said, "Yes, he is. He's, Pocatello High School student." Joe Richmond, the editor, says, "Well, I've read a couple of his pieces in the school paper. I think you ought to ask him to come see me because we may have an opportunity for him." So I did, and I got a job as a high school student at the local daily newspaper. And what it did was lead me to just one mention I'd like to make to you today. You've already made a really important step today and made a really important decision to be here. That is a step toward engagement. And I recently read some advice from a professor, I believe he works at either Harvard or Columbia, who said to everyone who's got an iPhone, who's in the iPhone generation, in the social media generation, Gen Z, the thing you should concentrate on doing most of all is being outside your house. So the world is not a basement bedroom, and there's a value in engagement because it allows you to visualize. That's what this engagement for me was enabled for me, a visualization of a path that I might take to satisfy my own intellectual interests, but also to I hope, engage in the world of ideas. And it's really an important thing you've done today. I just want to thank you for being here. I want you to know that you are within just a couple of years of having the opportunity to join someone like Mia Maldonado of the Idaho Capital Sun, who is 1 year out of the College of Idaho, as a thought leader in a conference where the world of ideas is in the mix. And so I couldn't express more this idea that the School of Public Service has at Boise State about the value of the work you may someday do if you choose this as part of your educational template for growth and development as an adult. So thank you and congratulations all of you for taking this step. And you're not far away from this podium and this round table and offering people the best of your ideas to help shape the world we live in for the future. So thanks so much. With that, I'd like to invite Rebecca Boone, who is the supervising correspondent of the Associated Press, working on the Associated Press's Democracy Initiative, Democracy Journalism Initiative, to introduce herself and how she got here.
Hi there. I got here because I like to write, and I'm much better at writing nonfiction than I am at fiction, I think. I have always been interested in finding things out. I think if you have a natural curiosity, that journalism is definitely the way to go. And it's kind of the perfect profession for a short attention span because you can deep dive into stories, learn everything you can learn about it quickly, write a great story, and then move on to the next topic. And that's what drew me to it initially. I moved around a lot as a kid, but went to high school in Eastern Oregon, went to college at the University of Idaho on a piano scholarship of all things, and attempted to double major for a while in piano performance and journalism. But I quickly realized that I'd much rather play piano to relax than like write news stories to relax at the end of a long day teaching piano. So I dropped the piano, remained in journalism, started right out of college with the Lewiston Morning Tribune, which is just a small, mid-sized regional paper in Idaho. And it was a great experience because it was a small enough paper that I got to cover the really big stories. I didn't have to wait around to get seniority. And eventually there was an opening at the Associated Press Bureau here in Boise. And AP had always been kind of my dream job, which is incredibly nerdy, but also something that a high school teacher sort of impressed on me. My high school journalism teacher was a retired reporter at a small paper on the Oregon coast. And he talked about how one day the AP picked up this story he'd written because there had been a shipwreck and a guy had clung to a buoy for hours, and then they found him like the next day after this horrible storm, and he wrote this great story and it got picked up by the AP. For those of you who don't know what the AP is, we're basically a large news cooperative. We're one of the largest news organizations, if not the largest news organization in the world. And so newspapers are members, and TV stations are members, and broadcast radio are members, and that gives us the ability to pick up their stories and send it out to the rest of the world, and also them the ability to pick up the stories that we write or produce and send it out. So he talked about how cool it was that AP picked up his story, and I thought, oh, that's where I want to work. Like, I don't want to be at one of these papers. I want to be the person in charge of who gets to pick stuff up and send it out. Like, that seems really exciting. So, in no small way, my high school journalism teacher is why I am where I am today. I had a lot of great mentors along the way, including a college professor who I still call regularly just to bounce ideas off of and to seek advice about burnout and next steps and all sorts of things. And that's Glenn Mosley at the University of Idaho, who's always been a great resource. So that's how I'm here. I'm here because of mentors, and I'm here because I love to write and because I love to find things out.
Mia Maldonado.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay? Hello, okay. I'm pretty soft-spoken, so hi everybody, my name is Mia Maldonado. I'm a reporter at the Idaho Capital Sun. The Idaho Capital Sun, if you haven't heard, we're a fairly new newsroom in Idaho. We started in 2021, and we're nonprofit, fully digital, and we cover state politics, the environment, housing, courts and policing, etc. And I, for all of the people under 20, it was not too long ago that I was in your shoes, so I don't know how I'm up here today. I graduated from the College of Idaho, as Scott said, in 2022. I was a double major in Spanish and international political economy, and I didn't have a journalism background, but I loved to write and I loved learning about the world. I was born and raised in Coeur d'Alene, so I love Idaho, and I come from a Latina immigrant background, so I always wanted to learn more about the world, about my culture, about where my parents came from. So that's kind of just that inherent curiosity that I always had is what led me to pursue journalism. And after I graduated college, I applied to the Voices Internship of Idaho, which is an internship for Latino students who are interested in pursuing journalism. Thankfully, I got the internship, and I worked for 10 weeks at the Idaho Capital Sun. Then after my internship, I was at the Idaho Statesman doing breaking news for 8 months. And then whenever a position opened back up again at the Capital Sun, I went back. So that's a little bit about my journey into journalism. But like Becky said, journalism is a lot about having curiosity and learning more about the world. That's something that I love reading about what's going on in other countries. And even if I'm, from small Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, it's journalism is a route that I've been able to kind of continue on my curiosity and to that I'm hoping to grow a lot more in this industry. But I'm really happy to be here and really happy to see that there's so many students here as well. Thank you.
Dr. Sam Martin, Boise State University.
Hi, y'all are getting pretty familiar with me. There's several versions of the story how I got here. I think the best one is that I loved watching The West Wing, and so I figured if I pursued studying media and democracy, I eventually would become Joshua Lyman. It's turned out a little bit different, but it's still pretty great. And I do have the good fortune to write a lot about media and democracy, and it's pretty wonderful. And when I think back on my life, I can think of a lot of people who really have left an indelible mark. My sixth grade teacher, Betty Olson, at that time in my life, I was obsessed with basketball, and I was in this thing called the Pepsi Hot Shot contest. And she would, on her weekends, on her Saturdays and Sundays, she would meet me at the elementary school. And she had been a basketball player, I think, at the University of Iowa. She would meet me at the elementary school basketball court and practice with me, and made me actually believe that I could win this national contest, I guess much like Frank Church winning the speech and debate contest. And I actually did advance to the regional finals at the halftime of a Utah Jazz game. And I think she was maybe the first person who really made me believe I could do something bigger and better than I would have imagined for myself. She told me it wasn't crazy. And there's many teachers who came after her. Certainly I can mention Russ Heller here, who's in the front row and who taught me all throughout my career at Boise High, but I think he's tired of my constant feeding of him. So we'll pretend that I didn't do that.
Mark Johnson, in my view, one of the most influential, if not the most influential members of media in Idaho of the last generation.
Thanks, Scott. So glad that you guys are all here, and I'm so glad that any of you under the age of 25 are here. You're the reason I'm no longer in the business, because you don't watch TV news. You raise your hand if you've seen television news. If you're under the age of, say, 30, raise your hand if you've seen any television news over the last week. Raise your hand. Okay? Raise your hand if you have been online on Twitter, now X, TikTok, or you don't watch Facebook. So any of the social media, raise your hand if you've gotten your news on social media over the last week. Yeah, that's the reason why television news is dying. I was told by my English teacher, she said, in high school, you like to write stories. I did the announcements every morning at my high school because I like to tell stories about the events of the day. And she said, you should get into the journalism class. And so I did, graduated. No apologies to Northwestern, Syracuse, or Columbia, but I went to the single greatest journalism school in the history of the world, University of Missouri. Go Missouri.
It's a good one, but Newhouse is pretty good.
Newhouse is good, yeah. Second to the University of Missouri, where we invented homecoming. I'm going back to the Holy Land this weekend. But I just learned that I could write stories and tell stories using the facts from whatever the event was that I was telling that story about. And whether I was doing sports or news or at times weather, there's a story to be told in everything that every journalist does. There's a story there. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And Sam knows that, Rebecca knows that, Mia knows that as a reader, as a viewer, as an ingester of news, I want to know what that story is. I want the facts. I want them straight, but I still want the story. A 20-second voiceover can still tell a story. And so that's what I did for the last 40 years. And now you're looking at what I do now.
Thank you all. We'll get into the questions. We've had some fun developing an agenda of questions today and some good difference of opinion. So we'll jump right in. The panel is called Fact, Truth, and the Media, and we're going to try to touch on the interrelationships of those concepts a little bit while we work today. So our first question has to do with what research is telling us. Many Americans distrust the government, distrust national media sources, and as bad as that is, it's still better than the 16% of people in 2021 who told the Pew Institute that they can trust Washington, D.C. to do the right thing. So the cynicism is there in the public, there's no question. Is there anything individual members of media can do in response to this lack of public trust and decline in public trust? Let's start with you, Rebecca.
Sure. Here, I'll move this a little closer. Maybe. There we go. Yeah, I mean, I think for journalists, credibility is my only currency. If I lose my credibility, I'm going to lose my sources. I'm going to lose my ability to find new sources. I'm going to lose my audience. So all I have to protect and further my career is to do the best I can to be truthful and factual and open to hearing people's stories without my own bias getting in the way, right? So I think that really building trust with the media, with any major sort of entity or industry or the government is the same thing. It's all about transparency. So what that means is that when we screw up, we write corrections. Corrections are important. We've gotten much better at them now, and that thanks to the digital world, right? Because they tend to update the story as it sits and as it's out there, as opposed to showing up 2 days later in a print newspaper. And we also, as we're updating stories with new information, we, are putting what we don't know. Like, we see it a lot. And it's sort of a new thing in media. If there is a report of a shooter someplace, the AP will say, there's been this report, this is what police say, but also this is what we don't know. We don't know if anyone has been injured. We don't know if it's been confirmed that it's a shooter. That's all part of maintaining transparency and building that trust. Another part of it is just protecting how we act in our personal lives as well. So because I'm with the AP, I don't share my opinions on a lot of things. My husband jokes that when I retire, it's just going to be like, I'm going to be the worst dinner party guest in the world, because all these years of pent up opinions are going to come out. But I also, I don't do bumper stickers. I don't do campaign signs. I don't sign petitions. I don't donate to campaigns. That's part of building trust, is that I need to be seen as somebody who's credible face to face to my neighbors, and also to the world at large when I'm covering stories.
Thanks, Becky. Sam, what's your take on this as an analyst of media coverage and behaviors?
So, truthfully, my least favorite statement is Americans don't trust the media, because everyone look around the room right now. Everyone here is dressed for a coolish fall day. And that is because you believed the weather report, right? And wherever you got the weather report, if it came off your iPhone or Android device, that's media, right? And you don't distrust that. You don't think that the weatherman is or the weather woman, you don't think that the weather person is. You're not mad that they're biased toward rain or cold weather or what. I mean, right? So. When you see a report on the news where if Becky writes a story and she says that there was an event downtown and people gathered at the Capitol and they were protesting a new local tax levy, you're not like, hogwash, that event didn't happen, right? People do trust the media, right? The question is really this deep suspicion that exists that I think we would all be wise to trouble, this suspicion that exists that if we have a worldview about the government, about politics, if we have a worldview and something happens that gets reported that causes us to have to wonder if our worldview is different, it's much easier to blame the political media than it is to take in that new information, right? So I'll give you an example of what I mean. I grew up, my parents were born in northeastern North Dakota. As my grandmother said, if you go 100 miles to the north, you're in Canada, and if you go 100 miles to the east, you're in Minnesota, but as it is, it's North Dakota. And so as a result, my dad did the horrible, horrible thing, which was make me a Minnesota Vikings fan, right?
That is a horrible thing.
And I really love the Vikings. And they had a good season last year, and they had a good team coming back. And I truly believed that my worldview going into this football season was that the Vikings would have a good season. I really believed it. And they are 1-5 and do not look to be improving. And it is horrible. But you know what? My worldview has changed. And I'm like, oh, same story. Right? Like, it fell for it again, but the Vikings are horrible. So I changed my mind, right? Now, let's say that let's just go back historically, and let's say that it's 1960. And I think that Richard Nixon is the candidate that I want to vote for in the presidential election against JFK. And a story comes out, and this is a made-up story because but let's say a story comes out that Richard Nixon he loves to streak baseball games, and he's going to do it at the World Series, right? What happens now when that story comes out is we wonder why the media hates Richard Nixon, right? Why are they telling that story? Why are you attacking my candidate? Well, the media is biased against, right? Well, the media may be imperfect, but rather than think, am I wrong about the Minnesota Vikings? Am I wrong about Richard Nixon? Am I wrong? We're upset about having to maybe rethink our facts. That, I think, is the conversation that needs to be had.
Mark, do you have a take on what the media could do to restore trust?
Well, I think, first of all, Scott, we have to define what is the media, and Sam could speak to that probably as well or better than any of us up here, because the media is all things, right? So your next door neighbor who comes over and tells you about the dog that's barking down the street and why she's calling the local animal control to get that dog fixed, shut up, she's become media because she's giving me information, right? So what is media and what is journalism? It's it doesn't really go hand in hand, because anybody that's giving you information could be termed a member of the media, regardless of whether they're getting paid or not. And so it used to be this really black and white thing about what media and what journalism is, and now it's so blurred and it's so gray, and you've got cable television, news networks
that have an obvious slant because of their advertisers that want that message on the airwaves. So is that true journalism slanting one way or another? You've got other sides slanting the other way. And so I guess for me, the whole trust thing, I think, boils down to who do you trust when you want to get your news? I mean, are you trusting your favorite contributor on Twitter or your favorite contributor on TikTok? Or is it Rachel Maddow on one side, or is it Sean Hannity on the other? Or is it the local news station that really can't show a slant because one advertiser that doesn't like your local news the way it's slanted on this story pulls their ads off, and now we have to eliminate somebody in the newsroom because of that. So it's really a gray area, and it's not defined on what media and journalism is anymore.
Thanks. Mia, as a young journalist, do you feel like you can speak for a generation in this effort to restore trust? And what would you do to articulate how we might go about that?
Yeah, thank you. I think I can speak to this question as a minority in Idaho. You know, Latinos are 13% of the population, and we're also, I'm pretty young as well, but I think a lot of mistrust comes from people not seeing themselves represented on TV or in writing, whether you're a young person, whether you're a mother of 5 that is struggling to pay her heating bill, or whether you're a person of color and you're not seeing yourself. So I think a way to repair that sense of trust, as like my job as a journalist, is to interview people, not the same people that I regularly go to, interview everyday people. How many, as just a show of hands, how many of you guys have ever spoken to a reporter for a story? Okay, that's a pretty good number. That's good. But I think a lot of my strongest stories are the ones when I'm interviewing just everyday people. And I try to make an effort to go to local experts or community members that are well known in the community. So whoever's reading or watching will see, oh, I know that person. They're a well-trusted person in the community. Or, oh, that person is a professor at BSU and they teach this person. So I think representation really matters, and especially whenever you want to gain trust from marginalized communities, and then just everyday people as well who are most impacted by policies that are being implemented. It's really important to interview those people as well.
Thank you. This conference has public trust in its title. The Frank Church Institute mission is to protect our democracy at a time of exceptional stress. Mark, do the responsibilities of a free press include serving as a sentry or defender of democracy? And as a working journalist, is that something that's anywhere near top of mind for you?
No, it's not. I don't think that I ever felt like I needed to be a defender or a sentry of democracy. I felt like I needed to be a speaker of truth. And that was top of mind, and I believe should be top of mind for all journalists. I never thought of myself as a defender of anything, but when I told a story, I wanted to tell the facts on both sides. What was it John Adams said? Facts are annoying because they're unwavering and they're inconsolable and they are not negotiable. And that's all I ever really thought of when I was doing a story. I wasn't trying to protect anything other than the facts of that story. And those are indefensible. Facts are indefensible. So they are defensible? Yes, they are defensible. Sam is a doctor.
Professors are the
She is a professor. She has a doctorate at the second greatest university in the world. And but these facts are undeniable, and they're rock solid, and that's what I based my profession on.
The bedrock, I think we can all agree, the bedrock forms the foundation of trust. Becky, what's your take on this idea of watchfulness of the cracks in the democracy?
Well, I have a slightly different take, and that I agree that I typically don't look. I've been covering the Maui wildfire for 2 months, right, and doing accountability journalism surrounding that specifically. And my job there is not to defend democracy or, you know, it's just to find out what went wrong and how things fell apart, and then write about it so that the people who live there can figure out how maybe not have it happen again. Right? That's my only role there. However, sometimes my role is defending democracy, and it's in a very limited scope, but in a very important one. And that is fighting for free press access. That is fighting for open government and open public records. That is fighting for the things that allow the press to tell the public what is going on so that the public can then decide what to do with that information. I've done that, you know, at the AP, I led an effort and we sued the state to get access to the initial part of the execution process, something that we may all be witnessing again very soon, where an inmate is brought into the death chamber and an IV is inserted because we knew that in other places there had been reports of that process going wrong. So having an outside independent observer is crucially important. We brought it to the federal courts and we won. We have made similar fights for public records, right? Filing public records requests to get information, having them wrongly denied, and then taking that to court. We do it with court access when things have been sealed to fight to get those documents opened. That's all part of increasing civic literacy and legal literacy and government literacy, and it's a crucial role of the press, and one that I actually feel really, really lucky to have.
Sam, as an observer and analyst of media coverage, is it fair to ask a century role of media for our democracy, and is it enough to go to put the facts on the bedrock and build from there?
Well, so media is a plural word, right? And we often forget that. So we speak about the media like it's a monolith, and it is not. And that's the first thing that I would say about that. And what my call is really different, and it sort of goes to the words that I said about Mr. Risen before he gave us his beautiful talk, which is that the privilege of being the media is you got to be in the room. You got to be in the room. And it doesn't really matter what kind of beat you have. So, you know, I often, when I'm teaching, I talk about how, you know, our democracy depends on a public sphere. A public sphere is a triangle with representatives, with the media, and with citizens. And it depends on a discourse. And very often I'll have students say to me, but I don't care about government. I don't really care. And I'll say, but you're not exempt from the public sphere. And they'll say, well, what do you mean? And I will say, well, what do you care about? And they'll say, well, I'm really into fashion. And I will say, okay, well, we also elect fashion representatives, right? And it's called the New York Fashion Show. It's called the Paris Fashion Show. And we have Vogue, and we have celebrities, and we have people who we look to, and when the Oscars happen, we have the best dressed and the worst dressed. And if you watched When the Devil Wears Prada, you've seen that epic scene with Meryl Streep where she says, you think you picked that out from the dustbin at the Gap, but you didn't, I chose that for you. And that came from the media, right? And so we select representatives to tell us what to wear. The media puts it out there, and the citizens talk about it and decide. And then always I make the joke that I clearly am not part of that public sphere because I'm wearing these clothes. And, right, same thing for sports, same thing for whatever. And so is the media the center? No, the media is a point on the triangle. And they're a point on the triangle because they get to be in the room. You're a sports reporter, you make it big time, you get to go to the Super Bowl. You're a politics reporter, you make it big time, you get to be in the Oval Office. And the responsibility that comes with that is Sam Martin doesn't get to do that. And so it's not good enough to just write a story and say you're not responsible to it. You have to ask the questions that the citizens want to know. And you have to write the story that tells them what they want to hear. And I'll just close by saying that very often the conversation, in my opinion, devolves into allowing government officials to say, don't trust the media, right? That guy's out to get me. We need to more often turn that question around and say to the government official, what do you have to gain? What do you have to gain by having the public not believe what the media is writing about you? What is in it for you, right? We sort of take it for granted sometimes, I think, that the media is fill in the blank. But when people tell you not to trust the story, they're not innocent. They have a stake in what you decide.
Mia, how can members of the media balance perception of fairness and still hold public officials accountable for what they say and do? In other words, is the public's interest in balance in your work inconsistent with this idea of holding officialdom accountable?
Yeah, I think just something that I encounter sometimes as a reporter is whenever I ask a question and people just kind of don't answer it, but give me this kind of surface level response. And that's when I have to kind of as uncomfortable as sometimes that makes me, it's like, no, my job is to give information to the public. And so you have to really ask hard questions that, that's when I get in the mindset, like, you're not just somebody that got out of college, you're somebody that, I'm in a position that where readers rely on a reliable news source to get answers. So you really have to ask the hard questions, and sometimes that's uncomfortable, but that's the only way you're going to get answers to things that are happening. Did that answer that question? If you guys want to add on a little bit.
Thank you. Anyone else with some thoughts on that?
Sure, I'll jump in. One of the first things that you're taught as a journalism student is if your mother says she loves you, check it out, right? So that doesn't mean you're calling your mom a liar. It means you're looking for evidence to support the claims. So that's what we do, and that's what Mia is talking about, I think. We're the watchdog of government, right? That's a sort of a nickname. And what that means is sometimes we have to be kind of oppositional during interviews. And part of that is because I think a lot of people don't understand is that many public figures actually have training in how not to answer the questions. So when sometimes you see complaints about bias in the media because, that reporter was being so hard or so aggressive on so-and-so, and you can tell that they just really didn't like that person. No, that's not the case. That's just two different types of training, like duking it out in the center ring, right? One person doesn't want to answer a question. One person wants to get a question answered, and there's only going to be one winner at the end of the day. So, I think what we need to do is just always keep that in mind. We have to listen to everybody. We have to have open minds. But at the same time, we have to get the information that needs to get out.
Yeah. I would concur. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm just fascinated by Mia's story and the fact that when this whole media is dead, journalism is outdated, and then you have somebody like Mia that's coming up and saying, no, to Sam's point, I want to be in the room. And she is. I'll never forget the day that I walked into the newsroom and I was completely soaking wet from the rain. And I went into the weather center and I told Rick Lance, I shouldn't use his name. I told our meteorologist that was, I told our meteorologist, it is freaking raining out there. And he looks at his computer and he goes, no, it's not. No. There's no front, there's no cell. I'm like, look at my jacket. I'm soaking wet. My hair is a mess. He's like, I'm looking at the computer, Mark. There's no rain. He wasn't in the room. He was not in the room. Mia is, and I just think it's so admirable that you have chosen this profession to, like, carry the torch, right, Becky? I mean, for crying out loud, hopefully you guys are inspired, you young people that are in school right now are inspired by people like Mia, because we do need more people like her to come up, because I'm a dinosaur, obviously, and we need people coming up behind us, and so thank you.
So there's this desire by journalists, I believe, to do the job, the vast majority of journalists, and do the job to the best of their ability. Becky, what should happen? What needs to happen when the media get it wrong? And what are the successful remedies to a factual error that damages or skews the public perception in some inappropriate way?
Well, there's a lot of things that can be done, and we're getting better at doing some of those things. So correctives are obviously like step one, like you got to fix that error as soon as possible, which is why I strongly recommend to anybody who is in a news story or who sees an error in a story, like, don't be shy. Let us know, because the quicker we know and we can fix it, the better. That being said, we have some people trying to correct what they see as errors that are actually not errors, and so then we just have to politely but firmly say no. I will say that some of what causes a lack of trust in the media at times is that what we don't report, like the choices we make in coverage, are just as important as the choices we make to not cover things. And where we can improve and fix that is to continue to build diversity and to remove the systemic barriers in our newsrooms that prevent us from getting a broad point of view that would open up our blind spots, right? I can't cover something that it doesn't occur to me to cover. And the things that occur to me to cover, like, I get those from talking to people, but also based on my own life experience in some way, or my own understanding, or, you know, what I know somebody else has gone through. Like, the way you learn about things is kind of the way journalists learn about things too. So if we don't have somebody with a completely different life experience or a completely different background or a completely different culture in the newsroom looking at potential stories based on their life experience, we are gonna miss stories. That's just how it is. And that's why it's so important that we have young people in journalism, that we have people from disadvantaged groups in journalism, that we have people from different cultures and different backgrounds.
Mia, could you?
I'm gonna be very rude and say I'm gonna jump off the stage. I have to go do the other part of a professor's job, which is teach a class. So your job, yeah, which starts in 2 minutes. So But I did want to say before we go that I love what you've just said. And I think I just wanted to mention before we leave that so much of life is interpretation. And when we talk about media and we talk about facts and we say we just want the facts, no, you don't. You want interpretation, right? That's why you want the color analysis. And interpretation means that you're getting an interpretation. You're getting a story, right? Humans are storytelling creatures. If I tell you a story about my vacation to Disneyland, you start thinking about your time at Disneyland. That's how it works. There's tons of research that shows that's how we make connections. And I think that when we understand that we're making interpretations, we can start to understand that the journalists are just humans too. And we have this idea, if they're only going to report the facts, then they're going to be right or wrong. But if they're making interpretations, then they're telling stories. The stories are valid, they're factual, they have a narrative, they have fidelity. But fidelity is different than fact. And, I'll just close by saying that I often think when I hear people complain about the media, I have that brother who yells at the referees and thinks that the referees are wrong. And I often look at him and I'm like, what? He has an office job. And I'm like, Bobby, did you send that email and forget to, how could you forget the attachment? Like, you get paid for that? You get paid to send your email? And he's like, what do you? I'm like, yeah, we all are imperfect humans, right? Like, what if someone screamed at you when you forgot your email attachment and told you that you didn't deserve to have your job, right? We'd all not made it, right? Interpretation and grace, right? Expecting the media to just be factual would just be very boring. It's just not how it is. So thanks for putting up with me. I will be back. All the best.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Sam. Mia, could you talk a little bit to the cultural sensitivities of corrective action from media? And this is a particularly interesting topic that I think you're really well positioned to comment on.
Yeah, just to echo a little bit of Rebecca's point, the same way whenever a friend makes a mistake and you want them to own up to that mistake is the same way we want the media to own up to their mistakes. So corrections are definitely something we always are happy to do, and it's good if, like Sam said, we make mistakes. As for the cultural sensitivity part and what we can do whenever, to prevent stigmas, this is a story one of my early mentors told me that whenever she was a journalist a few years ago, there was a crime in Nampa, and the headline of that story was "Black refugee man does something." Like, I don't remember the crime, but whenever you think about it, it's like, why does it matter that he's Black? We never say white person did this. Why does it matter that they're a refugee? Like, why are we adding words that are contributing to negative stigmas to already a marginalized group? So something that I took away from that story was, words matter. Words can wound in headlines, and so that's something I'm always really considerate of in my headlines is, yes, as a journalist, we have an 85 character word count in our little headline, but you want to get as much information as you can in there and being sensitive to groups that you're covering. But you also never want to just throw out words that are being used throughout the community in a harmful way. And it's difficult sometimes because not every news, if you're a corporate newsroom that relies on how many clicks you get, sometimes you want to add those big words in there. At the Idaho Capital Sun, we're a nonprofit newsroom, so we don't rely on clicks. So that's, even if it's a boring headline, you really want, I'm always really conscious, don't use words that can contribute to those bad stigmas. And if you do make a mistake in a story or a headline, then you need to learn from that. You need more diversity and equity training. You need to listen to the diverse voices in your newsroom that might be skeptical of the way you're framing the story, and really listen to those voices and prioritize that over clicks or how many retweets you'll get.
Thank you so much. This is a big room, but I hear growling stomachs, and I can't tell you how excited I am personally to get to our luncheon keynote. Some of the subject matter we've found in our household on YouTube related to the public statements of our keynote speaker, Gina Bennett, are fascinating. So I'm really stoked. I want to thank all of you for your participation and your great attention, and especially our expert panel, just tremendous perspectives. Thanks to each of you for sharing your experience and your minds with us. And Mark, you can probably break for golf. Mia and Becky have to get back to work. Thanks, everybody.